Welcome to Secrets of History, where the past doesn't just whisper, it awakens. Here, buried truths rise from the dust, shadows speak in forgotten tongues, and every mystery dares you to look deeper. Step inside, where history reveals the darkness it tried to hide. They were the town's saints. The Lenley family built everything, the churches, the schools, the orphanages. Their charity was legendary. But every coin has two sides. Their secret was buried in the East Wing. A secret that demanded a price not even their fortune could pay. A secret that consumed their own children. For a century, the truth was kept silent by a town bought and paid for. But on her deathbed, the last Lenley heiress broke the family's vow. Her final confession to a reporter and a priest wasn't for forgiveness. It was an accusation from the grave. She revealed the ledger. Not of money, but of names. A transaction of souls disguised as charity. And she warned them, the offering must continue. Now, the lights in the sealed East Wing are flickering back to life. The caretaker of their cursed pact is still waiting. And the next name in the ledger could be yours. The Lenleys are gone. But the thing they fed is still hungry. The rain had already begun to fall when she spoke her final words. Inside the crumbling Lenley manor, the last of her bloodline lay surrounded by shadows, her voice thin, her eyes fixed on the portrait of a family long erased from memory. For nearly a century, the Lenleys ruled this town from their marble halls and empty smiles, their name etched into every school, every church, every secret donation that kept the silence alive. But that night, silence finally broke. For decades, she refused the press, refused visitors, refused to be remembered. Until one evening, 3 days before her death, she summoned two strangers, a pastor and a reporter, and demanded that the truth be recorded. Her confession wasn't meant for forgiveness. It was meant for reckoning. They said her words began softly, then grew heavier, as if the weight of generations pressed against her lungs. She spoke of the fire no one investigated, of the orphans who vanished after the Lenley Foundation's charity drives, of a ledger, crimson-stained, locked away in the East Wing that chronicled every transaction the family made to keep the town quiet. When she finished, the air itself seemed to still. The clock stopped. The house exhaled. And within 24 hours, she was gone, leaving behind a single instruction: do not let them bury the truth with me. What followed would tear the town apart, because her confession didn't just expose the dead. It accused the living. The story begins with a haunting tone that encapsulates the weight of time and guilt surrounding the last surviving Lenley. She is not merely an old woman nearing death, but the living echo of a dynasty that once commanded reverence and fear in equal measure. Her frailty is not just physical, it is the decay of legacy, the slow unraveling of a name that once ruled with both opulence and secrecy. The manner in which she lies reflects her condition, walls cracking under the pressure of years, chandeliers hanging like ghosts of forgotten grandeur, and corridors humming with memories that refuse to rest. The silence in the house feels alive, almost sentient, as if it has been waiting decades to hear what she is about to confess. Every tick of the clock is a reminder that truth has a time limit, and hers is nearly expired. Outside, the world has changed, but within these walls, history is trapped, preserved like a specimen behind glass. The last matriarch embodies the residue of generations that believed wealth could cleanse sin, that lineage could outlast consequence. Her presence alone is enough to unsettle those who enter her home. There is a gravity to her silence, an unspoken sense that she carries more than her years, she carries the ghosts of an entire bloodline. The air around her seems colder, as though the very space rejects warmth, demanding respect for the weight of what she knows. Her frailty, though pitiable at first glance, becomes symbolic of decay itself. The once dominant Lenley name now breathes through her labored sighs, fading with every heartbeat. She represents the final thread of a tapestry woven with deceit, power, and loss. Those who come to see her, the nurse, the priest, the distant relative, sense that her eyes hold stories too heavy to speak aloud. Yet beneath her weakness lies an eerie composure, a serenity that suggests she has made peace not with redemption but with revelation. It is in this frail and haunted frame that the true essence of the story takes root. The duality of her existence, both victim and accomplice, witness and participant, defines the moral tension that drives her final confession. The haunting tone emerges not from fear of death but from the awareness that death may not erase the echoes of truth. The audience senses that what she carries within her is not just a secret but a burden so profound that it has distorted her very soul. The image of her alone, surrounded by portraits of those long gone, becomes the visual heartbeat of the tale, a woman standing at the edge of mortality, finally ready to open the vault of silence her family built, knowing that some truths can haunt even after the final breath. The story unfolds within an atmosphere thick with sensory tension, where every sound and shadow becomes a living participant in the moment. The silence of the manor feels deliberate, as if the house itself is holding its breath, waiting for what the Final Lenley is about to say. The ticking clock echoes through the vast, decaying halls like a countdown to revelation, its rhythm slow and haunting, each tick a whisper of time running out. Outside, rain slides down stained glass windows that once told stories of faith and virtue, now dulled by dust and sorrow. The faint scent of damp wood mingles with the sterile odor of medicine, creating a scent that feels suspended between life and death. These details build an immersive tension that mirrors the matriarch's state, her body failing, but her mind sharper than ever, anchored to a single purpose: to unburden herself before the darkness takes her. The faint flicker of candlelight dances across her face, revealing the deep etchings of age and guilt. Her breath comes unevenly, yet every inhale feels intentional, as though she is drawing in strength from the air itself. The rain outside grows heavier, beating against the glass like impatient fingers demanding entry, echoing the restless secrets trapped within the walls. A faint creak from the corridor reminds everyone in the room that they are not alone. The house itself seems to be listening, straining to hear the words it has waited decades to absorb. The ticking of the clock becomes more than a sound, it becomes a symbol of inevitability, the relentless march of truth toward exposure. The manor, once filled with lavish gatherings and echoes of laughter, now stands hollow, its silence replaced by the slow pulse of anticipation. Even the portraits of the Lenley ancestors seem to watch from the walls, their painted eyes cold and unblinking, as if demanding she remain silent to protect the family name. Yet, she doesn't look away. Her gaze lingers on the past, unflinching, as though challenging the ghosts that shaped her life. The sensory world surrounding her builds a palpable tension that draws the listener inward, compelling them to feel the weight of every passing second. The rain becomes the town's collective conscience, washing against the glass but never reaching the rot within. The ticking clock reminds that confession is not eternal, it demands to be spoken before the final silence arrives. And in that fragile moment, between the fading heartbeat and the rising storm, the boundaries between the living and the dead blur. The world holds still, suspended between sound and silence, as the last Lenley prepares to speak, and history itself seems to lean closer, ready to finally listen. The Lenley family was once the cornerstone of their town's identity, a dynasty that rose from the ashes of obscurity to command respect, influence, and fear. Their name was engraved on every cornerstone, whispered in every deal, and immortalized in plaques that lined the town's oldest streets. The Lenleys were the benefactors, the patrons of progress, and the supposed moral pillars of their community. Yet behind their charitable facades and immaculate reputations lay an empire built on silence and control. Every act of generosity masked a deeper motive, and every smiling portrait that hung in the town hall concealed the shadows of manipulation. Their wealth was inherited not merely through fortune but through the careful burial of truth, the kind that stains a legacy long after the bloodline fades. To outsiders, The Lenleys seemed almost mythic, a family untouchable by time, politics, or scandal. They sponsored orphanages, funded hospitals, and rebuilt churches after fires they themselves were rumored to have started. Their reach extended beyond wealth into the moral fabric of the town, where loyalty was purchased through opportunity, and silence was the price of favor. Each generation learned the unspoken code: protect the name, no matter the cost. Behind the grandeur of their estate, hidden corridors and locked rooms served as archives of their secrets, letters never sent, ledgers never shown, confessions never spoken aloud. Over the years, as the town grew, so did the myth of the Lenleys. Their story became local folklore, the family that gave everything, and in return, asked only for loyalty. But beneath this veneer of nobility, something corrosive festered. Workers whispered about disappearances tied to the family mills. Servants vanished without farewell. Records of charitable donations revealed inconsistencies that no one dared question. The mayor, the police chief, even the clergy seemed entangled in the quiet machinery of Lenley influence. And so, the town learned to live in selective blindness, worshipping the very hands that quietly tightened their chains. The once revered dynasty eventually became a relic of another time, its members dying younger with each generation, as if the sins of their predecessors lingered like a curse. By the time the last Lenley lived, the name had lost its grandeur, surviving only in rumors and old photographs. Yet the echoes of their rule remained, embedded in the architecture, in the stories parents told their children to warn them about ambition and pride. The final matriarch carried not just the family's blood but its accumulated guilt, a living monument to what unchecked power and silence can create. The once mighty Lenleys, now reduced to one frail voice, still haunted the town that had built its identity upon their lies. The town that surrounded the Lenley estate had always existed in the shadow of its grandeur. Its streets, once cobblestone and proud, were lined with buildings financed by Lenley wealth, the church, the courthouse, even the orphanage bore plaques engraved with their name. To the townspeople, the Lenleys were both saviors and sovereigns, the silent architects of prosperity and despair. Their influence was woven so deeply into the foundation of the town that separating one from the other was impossible. Yet beneath the charm of its lamplit evenings and the polite nods exchanged in Sunday sermons lay a quiet dread, an unspoken understanding that the town owed its comfort to something unspeakable. The locals whispered that the soil itself was cursed, that no fortune came from the Lenleys without a debt that could never truly be repaid. Generations of families had worked for them, miners, servants, accountants, and clergy, all tied to the estate in one form or another. Their livelihoods depended on the benevolence of the family, and so they learned to keep their heads down, to ask no questions when strange noises echoed from the old mill at night or when a face disappeared from the market without explanation. The Lenleys funded the festivals, the schools, and the bridges, and in return, the town offered silence. It became an unspoken pact: the family gave, and the people forgot. Their history was written not in newspapers but in rumors, carried through generations like a ghost story whispered at the edge of candlelight. Over time, the town began to reflect the rot of the family it served. The streets near the manor grew quieter, homes abandoned after generations of caretakers fell ill or left without reason. The once lively square was reduced to a polite facade, a stage for public gratitude masking private fear. The Lenley name became both a blessing and a curse. To be associated with them was to be respected, but also watched. And while the outer world moved toward modernity, this small corner of the country seemed frozen in another century, where power was inherited, and truth was buried beneath polished marble. The Lenley fortune had built the town's identity, yet it had also built its silence. Every monument erected in their honor stood as a gravestone for someone else's voice. Those who lived long enough to remember the family's rise spoke less as they aged, as though the past demanded tribute through forgetfulness. The town's foundations trembled not from earthquakes or storms but from the quiet weight of secrets layered beneath its streets, and when the last Lenley prepared to speak, it wasn't only her own confession the town feared, it was the unmasking of the very story it had built its peace upon. The Lenley Empire was not built through labor or innovation but through silence, persuasion, and fear that seeped into the bones of everyone who lived beneath their shadow. Generational wealth became a weapon, used not to nurture but to control. They understood early that influence wasn't about visibility, it was about the art of quiet dominance, the ability to make people grateful for their own submission. The Lenleys funded the town's progress with one hand and sealed its conscience with the other. Each donation came with invisible terms, each act of generosity a transaction that purchased loyalty and erased questions. Over time, people stopped asking how the Lenleys acquired their fortune. The mills, the mines, the land deals all were whispered to have origins soaked in deceit, but no one dared speak aloud what they suspected. Power, once acquired through fear, sustains itself through gratitude, and the Lenleys perfected that illusion. Their influence extended beyond wealth into the moral fabric of the town. Mayors, priests, and teachers all found themselves indebted in ways they couldn't undo. The family knew the price of every favor, every silence. Letters were burned, witnesses relocated, and any trace of dissent vanished beneath the weight of reputation. For decades, their image remained unblemished, a monument of benevolence erected on a foundation of quiet ruin. The family motto carved into the stone arch above the estate's gate read, * in honor, we build, * though those who served within its walls knew it might as well have said, * in silence, we survive. The Lenley children were raised to understand that reputation was the family's greatest currency. They learned early to smile in public and listen in private, to treat loyalty as inheritance and fear as tradition. Each generation perfected the art of discretion until truth itself became a foreign language. Servants who stumbled upon things they shouldn't have seen were paid generously to forget. Others, less fortunate, simply vanished, their names omitted from records as though they had never existed. It wasn't cruelty that kept the machine turning, it was necessity, the belief that one family's sins could hold the town together if no one dared to question them. By the time the last Lenley inherited the estate, the town had forgotten how to exist without them. Their wealth had become its lifeblood, its silence the price of peace. The family's power, once built on empire and industry, had evolved into something more insidious, a cultural dependency where fear had long been replaced by comfort. And yet, beneath that illusion of prosperity, guilt festered like rot beneath polished floors, waiting for the final Lenley to break the pattern, to turn fear into confession and expose the quiet tyranny that had sustained them for generations. For decades, she lived in near-total isolation, a silent relic of a family that once commanded every conversation in town. After the deaths of her siblings and the quiet disintegration of the Lenley name, she withdrew completely from the world that had once bowed before her family's power. The grand estate became both her fortress and her prison, its iron gates sealed, its curtains drawn, its halls echoing only with the footsteps of a few loyal servants who stayed not out of affection, but out of obligation. She refused interviews, declined public appearances, and rejected every attempt at reconciliation from the town officials who once sought her approval. To the younger generation, she became a myth, a woman hidden behind glass, rumored to have gone mad, cursed, or consumed by guilt. No one truly knew. What was certain was that the Lenley estate, once the beating heart of the town, now stood like a mausoleum, its last inhabitant fading quietly inside. Her absence from public life only deepened the mystery. Journalists who tried to uncover her story were turned away by guards or left shaken after brief glimpses of her in the upper windows, a frail silhouette watching from behind heavy drapes. Those who remembered her from youth described her as poised, articulate, and commanding, but time had transformed her into something spectral, a woman detached from both reality and redemption. Some said she was haunted by her family's sins, others believed she was preserving secrets too dangerous to tell. The truth was that her silence served as both punishment and protection, a vow she could not break until the end approached. Letters addressed to her went unanswered, and invitations to public events were returned unopened. The few visitors who entered her home, doctors, caretakers, or legal advisors, spoke of a presence that felt heavier than loneliness. Every room she occupied carried a stillness that unsettled even the most composed guests. She communicated rarely, choosing instead to spend hours alone in the West Parlour, surrounded by old photographs and unread newspapers. The house seemed to have stopped in time, the clocks unwound, the fires unlit, the air heavy with memories that refused to fade. To the town outside, she was both a ghost and a warning, the price of unchecked legacy. Her refusal to engage became a statement louder than any confession. It was as though she understood that silence itself could become a monument, that by vanishing from the world she once ruled, she could preserve the illusion of nobility while hiding the rot beneath it. Yet even in her isolation, the weight of truth pressed closer, waiting for the moment when silence would no longer protect her, but demand to be broken. As her health began to deteriorate and time grew short, the Final Lenley did something no one in town expected. After decades of silence, she summoned two individuals to the estate, a pastor who had long served the local parish, and a young reporter from the regional paper known for his curiosity about the family's hidden history. The invitation arrived without explanation, handwritten in an unsteady script, sealed with the faded Lenley crest that had not been used in years. Those who received it felt the weight of history behind every stroke of ink. For the first time in generations, the doors of Lenley Manor would open, not for a celebration or a ceremony, but for a reckoning. The servants, few and aging, whispered among themselves, uncertain of what awaited those invited inside. The pastor came out of duty, believing it was a call for confession or final absolution. He had baptized her decades earlier and presided over the funerals of her kin. To him, she was a remnant of another world, one bound by sin and secrecy, now reaching for salvation. The reporter came for different reasons. He had spent years chasing the Lenley legend, collecting fragments of rumors that never aligned. To him, this was not a pastoral visit, it was an opportunity to unearth the truth the town had tried to bury. The convergence of faith and curiosity under the same roof felt almost symbolic, as if fate itself had chosen these two to hear the story that would shatter everything they thought they knew. When they arrived, they found the manor in a state of haunting preservation. Dust clung to portraits, the chandeliers hung heavy with cobwebs, and the smell of old paper filled the air. She greeted them not as guests but as witnesses. Her body was frail, wrapped in blankets, yet her eyes burned with a strange intensity, not fear, not desperation, but resolve. She spoke little at first, as if measuring the worth of her listeners, then gestured for them to sit close. The only light came from a single lamp beside her bed, casting deep shadows across her face. Neither the pastor nor the reporter could have anticipated what would follow. What began as a quiet visit transformed into a confessional unlike any other. Her voice trembled but never faltered as she began to peel back the decades of silence. The air grew thick with unease, and as the storm outside gathered strength, both men realized that they were not there to offer comfort or collect a story, they had been chosen to bear witness to the truth that would redefine the town's history forever. Her voice, when she finally began to speak, carried the fragility of age but the precision of someone who had rehearsed her words countless times in silence. Every syllable trembled with exhaustion yet landed with deliberate weight, as though she understood that this was her last chance to shape how history would remember her. The pastor sat with his hands folded, his expression caught between empathy and unease, while the reporter's pen hovered just above the page, waiting to capture what had been hidden for nearly a century. The sound of rain against the glass seemed to fade, replaced by the soft cadence of her confession, each word falling like dust from an ancient archive being opened for the first time. She did not speak quickly. Her pauses were intentional, calculated, forcing her listeners to sit in the discomfort of what was being revealed. Her breathing was uneven, but her mind remained sharp, her tone shifting between remorse and authority. It was not the voice of a woman seeking forgiveness, but of someone determined to be understood. There was an eerie calm in her delivery, as if she had long made peace with what she was about to expose. The weight of her words seemed to fill the room, pressing against the air until even the ticking of the old clock sounded hesitant. Occasionally, she would glance toward the darkened corner of the room, as though expecting a response from the ghosts of those who once filled the manor's halls. The pastor noticed this but dared not interrupt, while the reporter wrote in feverish silence, trying to keep pace with the unfolding revelation. Her tone shifted when she spoke of certain names, softer for some, sharp and resentful for others. It was clear that she had carried these stories like wounds that had never healed. The cadence of her speech resembled a sermon turned inside out, sacred yet damning. The tremor in her voice was not fear, it was the tremor of release, of decades of secrecy finally being lifted from her shoulders. Her hands, though frail, remained still, resting atop a faded photograph of her family. The image beneath her fingers was smudged, as if touched too often, an anchor to both memory and regret. What unsettled her listeners most was not the content of her confession but the clarity with which she spoke. Every word seemed prepared, chosen, and protected until this very night. She had not stumbled into confession, she had built toward it, brick by brick, over a lifetime. Her trembling voice, though weak, carried the gravity of generations, and with each breath she took, it became increasingly clear that this was not a dying woman recounting sins, it was history itself, finally choosing to speak through her. Her confession began in a way that caught both men off guard. It was not a plea for forgiveness, nor a rambling of memories softened by age. It was precise, deliberate, almost chilling in its detachment. She spoke not like a sinner seeking absolution, but like a witness presenting evidence in a trial that had been delayed for decades. Her words were stripped of sentiment, her tone eerily steady, as if the truth she was about to reveal had long ceased to wound her. The pastor, expecting repentance, shifted uncomfortably as her story unfolded, realizing that she wasn't asking for God's mercy, she was delivering a verdict. The reporter, torn between awe and dread, felt that he was not recording a confession but transcribing the dismantling of an entire legacy. She began by rejecting the notion that the Lenleys had been victims of misfortune or cursed by fate. The tragedies that befell them, she said, were not the result of divine punishment but of deliberate choices, acts made in greed, fear, and self-preservation. Each generation had inherited not just wealth but guilt, a moral debt passed down like property. The fire that destroyed the old factory was no accident. The missing children from the orphanage were not runaways. The charitable trusts and donations that had made the family so beloved were nothing more than veils, distractions carefully crafted to keep suspicion at bay. Her voice never faltered as she named names, recited dates, and recalled details too exact to be the product of fading memory. What made the moment more haunting was the lack of remorse in her tone. It was not cruelty that hardened her words, but clarity. She was no longer bound by the fear that had defined her ancestors. Death had freed her from loyalty. She confessed not to be forgiven, but to expose, to ensure that truth, long buried beneath marble and money, would finally surface. The pastor's eyes filled with disbelief, his faith in the moral order trembling with each revelation. The reporter's hand shook as he wrote, realizing that every word she spoke would ignite chaos once it left the manor's walls. She paused only once, to draw a deep, rattling breath, before declaring that her family had not been protectors of the town, they had been its captors. Their wealth had enslaved generations under the guise of charity. And now, as her body failed, She could no longer allow the lie to live beyond her. Her confession was not an act of guilt, it was rebellion against the silence that had built the Lenley empire. In that moment, her frail voice became something larger than her, it became justice speaking through the very bloodline that had once silenced it. The disturbing events surrounding the Walthers' East Wing, the sealed-off part of their mansion that became the center of every whispered rumor and unexplained disappearance. It was once meant to be a charitable expansion, a sanctuary for children without homes, but soon after it opened, neighbors reported strange sounds echoing through the night, low moans, mechanical hums, and what some claimed were cries abruptly silenced. Servants began quitting without notice, leaving their wages behind, claiming they saw figures in the hallways that vanished when approached. The Walthers dismissed it all as superstition, yet they forbade anyone from entering the East Wing after dusk. Local builders recalled that the blueprints for that section of the mansion didn't match what was actually constructed. There were hidden doors, blind corridors, and chambers with no windows. No one knew what those rooms were truly for. Then came the incident that silenced the town entirely, the disappearance of the Walthers' 3 adopted children. They had been seen playing in the garden that morning, laughing and carefree, but by nightfall, they were gone. The parents claimed the children had wandered off, but the gates were locked, and their shoes were found neatly arranged by the entrance to the East Wing. The police investigation that followed was shrouded in confusion. Evidence went missing, statements were retracted, and the case was quietly closed as a runaway. Yet the servants who remained insisted the East Wing lights stayed on all night after that, flickering as though someone or something still moved within. Years later, when the mansion was finally abandoned, explorers who dared to enter described walls lined with strange symbols and an oppressive silence that seemed to swallow sound. In one locked chamber, they found a small wooden chair, restraints built into the arms, and markings on the floor resembling ritual circles. Others claimed to have found faded ledgers listing donations, but instead of money, the entries were children's names and dates. The implication was monstrous. The East Wing may have been a facade for something much darker than charity, something that fed on innocence under the guise of salvation. Even today, those who pass the ruins of the Walthers' estate say the air near the East Wing feels different, thicker, colder, as if the walls themselves remember what happened. The truth buried inside those halls was never recorded, but the pattern of vanishing, silence, and cover-up painted a single conclusion: the East Wing wasn't haunted by ghosts. It was haunted by what the Walthers had done within its walls. The delves into the forbidden heart of the Walthers Empire, the financial foundation that quietly fed the horrors of the East Wing. On paper, the Walthers were hailed as the most benevolent family in the county, their name etched into churches, hospitals, and orphanages. Yet beneath the gilded surface, their charity funds were channels for something far more sinister. Bank ledgers recovered decades later revealed a recurring pattern: massive withdrawals under the guise of charitable allocations that led to ghost accounts, institutions that didn't exist, orphanages without buildings, and relief funds with no beneficiaries. Every dollar seemed to disappear into an invisible network controlled by the patriarch, Elias Walther. Elias was a meticulous man, calculating, composed, and utterly obsessed with control. Those who worked for him described his office as a cathedral of order, shelves of identical ledgers, each marked only with symbols instead of titles. He would spend long hours inside, muttering equations or reciting names as if they were incantations. When questioned about the missing funds, he claimed the money went toward spiritual restoration programs for the children they sheltered. But the programs were never documented, and the children who entered them never returned. This strange pattern mirrored the physical disappearances that plagued the East Wing, an unsettling symmetry between vanishing lives and vanishing money. Over time, whispers began circulating that the Walthers' fortune had supernatural roots. Townsfolk said Elias had struck a bargain in his youth with a secret society that promised unending prosperity in exchange for offerings that could not be bought with gold. Whether myth or truth, the evidence of his growing wealth amid repeated personal tragedy raised questions no one dared ask publicly. His wife, Margaret, maintained the illusion of piety, hosting charity galas beneath portraits of saints, yet her eyes betrayed sleeplessness and fear. The servants noticed she often stood outside the east wing at night, clutching a rosary so tightly her palms bled. When the estate finally went bankrupt years later, auditors found the Walthers' accounts frozen not by financial collapse, but by design. Every asset was redirected into a trust labeled for continuation, with no named heir and no purpose explained. The document's final clause was sealed with a crimson wax sigil no one recognized, and any attempt to trace its origin led to dead ends. The investigators themselves began resigning one by one, reporting nightmares and visions of hollow-eyed children before they quit. Whatever the Walthers were funding, it was not of this world's making. The financial web they left behind suggested that their charity wasn't meant to save lives, it was built to sustain something that required lives as currency. The moment the truth began to surface, when the Final Lenley matriarch, bedridden and frail, decided to unburden her soul before death. For decades, she had lived as the silent custodian of her family's sins, carrying the weight of every missing name, every sealed document, every child never spoken of again. Her confession didn't come to a priest or a lawyer but to a young nurse, newly assigned to her care, unaware of the storm about to be unleashed. The nurse described her voice as a whisper made of ash, uneven, trembling, yet carrying an ancient authority, like someone speaking from the edge of two worlds. She said she had been waiting for a witness, someone who would not belong to the Lenleys, someone untouched by the bloodline's curse, to hear what the town was never meant to know. The confession began with a phrase the nurse would never forget: "We were never blessed, we were chosen to pay." She spoke of the first Lenley pact, forged generations earlier, when the family's fortune had begun to crumble after a devastating fire took the original estate. To restore what was lost, the patriarch turned not to banks or merchants but to an unnamed figure described in family journals as the benefactor. The agreement demanded not money, but continuance, a word the matriarch explained with tears as the preservation of power through sacrifice. Each generation had to offer something pure, someone untainted, to keep the family's name alive. At first, it was animals, then property, then strangers. But by the time her father inherited the estate, the offerings had turned inward, blood for blood. She confessed that the missing heirs weren't victims of tragedy or illness, as the town had been led to believe, but deliberate sacrifices carried out beneath the east wing, where an altar of old stone still stood, its carvings eroded by years of ritual. The family had kept its empire intact through what they called the exchange, conducted every 25 years when the Lenley fortune seemed to falter. The matriarch's husband, she admitted, had continued the ritual even after their children disappeared, claiming it was their duty to preserve what their ancestors began. She had been complicit by silence, locked in fear and superstition, too bound by guilt to resist. Her confession ended with her voice breaking, as she revealed the truth that shattered the nurse's composure. The final offering had already been made long ago, but the promise was broken when the bloodline refused to continue. The curse, she said, would not fade with her death, it would simply look for another vessel. The room fell silent, the air turning cold, and the nurse swore the old woman's eyes seemed to look past her, as if watching something standing just behind her shoulder. She descends into the aftermath of the confession, the chaos, disbelief, and eerie validation that followed once the nurse tried to share what she had heard. The nurse, still shaken and sleepless, approached the authorities the next morning with trembling hands, clutching the old woman's recorded words. But when they arrived at the Lenley estate, the matriarch was gone. Not dead, not missing, gone. Her bed was empty, her blankets still warm, and the nurse's recording device had been reduced to static. The medical staff swore she had been alive just hours earlier, but every trace of her charts, files, even her hospital bracelet had vanished from official records. It was as if the system itself had erased her. The police dismissed the nurse's claims as a product of exhaustion, citing stress and hallucination, but whispers began to spread through town that the old Lenley woman had been taken back. Days later, strange disturbances began rippling through the estate grounds. Workers clearing the property for auction reported hearing voices beneath the East Wing foundation, soft chanting that ceased the moment anyone approached. The foreman quit after discovering a sealed door behind the old wine cellar, its hinges fused by rust and time. When he pried it open, a narrow staircase led downward into a chamber that reeked of burnt iron and damp earth. The walls were lined with markings, half crosses, half symbols unrecognizable to any scholar. In the center stood a stone pedestal carved with the Lenley crest, and atop it, a single object, a tarnished silver key, engraved with the initials CL, Catherine Lenley, the matriarch's own name. Experts brought in to evaluate the find began to notice something unnerving. Each photograph taken of the chamber developed distorted, figures appearing in the background that hadn't been there in person, outlines of children staring toward the camera, their faces blurred as if the lens refused to remember them. One historian claimed that the symbols etched into the walls resembled those found in early 18th century grimoires associated with preservation rituals, specifically ones meant to bind a lineage to its promise. He theorized that the Lenleys' fortune had indeed been tethered to something ancient, something that demanded renewal with every generation. The town tried to suppress the discovery, sealing off the estate again under the guise of structural instability. But by then, it was too late. The nurse who first heard the confession began to deteriorate, sleepwalking, writing the same words over and over on her walls: the promise must continue. Her handwriting, analysts later noted, matched Catherine Lenley's perfectly. And though her voice cracked with exhaustion during her final interview, she swore she could still hear the matriarch whispering in her dreams, saying, "You heard it. Now you hold it." The haunting transformation that overtook the town in the wake of the confession's exposure and the estate's rediscovery. What had begun as whispers of superstition evolved into a quiet, collective dread. Businesses near the old Lenley property began closing early, claiming strange flickers of light seen in their windows after dusk, as though lanterns were burning deep beneath the ground. Those living closest to the estate reported the scent of smoke and lilies drifting through the air at night, the same flowers once used in the Lenley funerals. Even the clock tower, dormant for years, began tolling on its own at 3:17 a.m., the same hour the matriarch was said to have died. For the older residents who remembered the family's legacy, these events were not coincidences. They were signals, the curse stirring once more after being disturbed. The nurse who had first carried the story became a recluse, retreating to a small house at the edge of town. Journalists who sought her out described her as thin, trembling, and perpetually cold, her windows covered in black cloth to block out the moonlight. When asked about the confession, she refused to speak of it directly, only saying that silence was safer than truth. Those who pressed her further found themselves plagued by vivid nightmares, dreams filled with the sound of crying children and the faint tolling of a bell. One reporter who mocked the legend publicly crashed his car 3 days later just outside the estate gates, his body found clutching a broken piece of tarnished silver in his hand. The fragment was later confirmed to match the key discovered in the chamber. The town council tried to erase the Lenley name, removing plaques and memorials, but it only seemed to deepen the unease. School children began drawing strange symbols on classroom walls, symbols eerily similar to those found beneath the estate. Animals refused to cross the property line, and even the weather seemed to turn against the area, storms lingering over the town for weeks, with lightning striking the same hill again and again. Psychologists were brought in to calm the public, labeling the fear as a form of collective hysteria, yet even they admitted that the energy around the estate felt unnatural, almost watchful. The few who dared to enter the Lenley grounds after nightfall described hearing music, an old waltz echoing faintly from nowhere, and seeing a woman's shadow glide along the upper windows. Some believed it was Catherine Lenley herself, bound to the estate, ensuring that her family's curse would not die with her confession. Others whispered that the curse had found new roots, feeding on the very fear that now consumed the town. Whatever the truth, something had shifted in that place forever. The Lenley estate no longer stood as a ruin of the past, it had become a living echo of everything the matriarch had tried, too late, to undo. The unsettling reawakening of the Lenley estate, the moment when the boundary between history and haunting began to dissolve completely. Months after the town sealed off the property, a development company from out of state purchased the land with plans to demolish the remains of the mansion and rebuild it into a luxury retreat. Locals protested quietly, warning that the ground was cursed, but the new owners dismissed it as folklore meant to scare away outsiders. Yet from the moment the demolition began, the workers sensed something unnatural beneath the soil. Machinery malfunctioned for no explainable reason, and every night, the floodlights positioned around the site flickered in rhythmic pulses, as if responding to something unseen. A foreman reported hearing footsteps on the upper floors impossible, since those floors had already been gutted. Another worker quit after finding his name carved into a wooden beam inside the east wing, even though no one had known it before. Then came the storm. On the third week of demolition, lightning struck the property's main scaffolding, killing 2 workers and injuring several others. Witnesses said the strike wasn't random, it arced directly toward the center of the exposed foundation, right where the chamber had once been uncovered. After the incident, the company halted all work, citing safety concerns. But that night, the cameras installed for insurance purposes captured something beyond explanation. At precisely 3:17 a.m., the same time that haunted the Lenley timeline, the lights along the property turned on in sequence, one by one, illuminating the ruins in a perfect circle. In the footage, a single figure appeared in the center, a woman in a dark gown, motionless, her face obscured by shadow. The frame glitched and distorted, and by the time it cleared, the figure was gone, leaving behind a faint shimmer of light that lingered like mist. Experts later analyzed the footage, searching for rational causes, camera interference, electrical surge, weather distortion, but none could replicate the anomaly. The remaining footage of that night was corrupted within hours, the files reducing to nothing but static and a low hum that technicians described as a human tone. The company withdrew its interest entirely, abandoning the site. Legal ownership reverted to the town, but no one dared step foot on the land again. Even the grass seemed to stop growing where the foundations had been disturbed, and at night, faint organ music could still be heard when the wind passed through the broken archways. The town once known for its quiet charm now lived under a silent tension. Tourists came and went, taking photos from a distance, unaware of what the locals refused to speak of, that every time someone tried to rebuild over the Lenley estate, the past rebuilt itself first. And somewhere within those ruins, the matriarch's promise still pulsed beneath the ground, waiting for another name to carry it forward. The unfolds in the aftermath of the estate's final abandonment, when the Lenley curse stopped being a whisper of superstition and began seeping into the living fabric of the town itself. Time seemed to stagnate around the ruins, roads that once led to the property began cracking from beneath, as if the earth rejected the idea of passage. Birds no longer nested in the surrounding trees, and those who passed too close often complained of dizziness, nosebleeds, or fleeting visions of people who weren't there. The air itself felt charged, heavy with the residue of something unfinished. Even the town's clocks began malfunctioning, their hands freezing at odd hours that matched entries in the Lenley journals, times associated with past deaths, disappearances, or ritual events. Scientists and electricians blamed magnetic interference, but deep down, everyone knew it was the echo of something far older than physics. The nurse, whose testimony had begun it all, vanished one winter morning. Her home was found unlocked, a kettle still whistling on the stove, and her journal open on the table. The final entry read only, "It's not gone, it's moving." That sentence became a grim prophecy. In the weeks that followed, reports of strange occurrences multiplied across town. A woman in a black dress was seen walking near the cemetery, always at a distance, always turning corners faster than her feet could carry her. Children spoke of the listening lady, who asked them to repeat their names 3 times before she smiled and vanished. Some dismissed these accounts as collective paranoia, but others began connecting the appearances with those who had descended from the families once tied to the Lenleys, descendants who, one by one, began dying under inexplicable circumstances. The atmosphere of dread thickened when the church bell, long silent, began ringing again at 3:17 a.m., echoing through the valley though the rope had been removed years before. The town's priest, overcome with guilt and fear, finally confessed that part of the old Lenley crypt lay beneath the church foundations, connected through sealed tunnels never charted in public records. When excavation began, the workers found rows of child-sized coffins, none bearing names, all sealed with silver nails. Inside one coffin was a single note written in the matriarch's hand, "The bloodline is unbroken." That discovery broke whatever fragile denial still lingered. The mayor ordered the tunnels resealed immediately, but by then, it didn't matter. The town's identity had become entwined with the curse. It lived in its soil, its architecture, its breath. People began leaving, abandoning homes that had been in their families for generations, saying the silence in the nights felt too aware, too human. And through it all, the Lenley estate stood untouched, the heart of a secret that refused to die, pulsing beneath a town now haunted by its own history. As the echoes of this unsolved mystery dissolve into the depths of forgotten time, remember, history never truly sleeps. It waits, watching, buried beneath the dust and the silence. Subscribe to *Secrets of History*, and step with us beyond the veil, where every artifact hides a heartbeat and every whisper carries a truth long denied. Activate the bell, and when the past calls again, you'll be the first to hear its voice.